Hello and welcome back to the KCC channel. I'm Rob and I hope you're having a wonderful day today. Today, we're jumping back into some Tales from Tech Support. Our first story today comes to us from Shoggy Seldom. Where are the project requirements? What do you mean? That's what we're paying you for. Let's jump right in. Over the last year or so, I've had the, pleasure of watching roughly 2/3 of our little consultant company's workforce quit and run for the hills, mostly due to the mismanagement of a pair of absolute train wreck projects. One to upgrade a completely functional but no longer supported by the vendor Angular tool site by completely rebuilding it all as a dedicated .NET thing. We're not going to dwell on all that silliness involved in this, though I will mention that when I first pitched in, they handed me a 1,200-line static HTML page that was very obviously created by copy-pasting the Angular output and having an intern manually go through it and set up the mappings. I don't really know how they wound up at that point, only there was a lot of uninformed promises and estimates in early phases and the constant rotation of people working on, realizing it's insane, and then quitting. Eventually, at the cost of the company's most senior developer and architect, that nosedive leveled off to the point where, only 8 months behind schedule, the customer now has an app just as good as the one they started with, and we can now start working on improvements. The other project didn't go nearly so well. To start with some important groundwork, our little company's CEO is comically out of touch. He used to code at some point, at least that's what he says, and believes this makes him an adequate subject matter expert as far as estimates and approaches go, and that he's one of us. Seriously, he keeps dragging the one on-site junior dev out to random lunches to shoot the crap and has invited us all to his virtual birthday party next month with instructions to bring an amusing or embarrassing anecdote about working with me. Imagine that energetic but unqualified guy that got added to your team, so you do your best to push him towards the pointless busy work tasks and have someone more senior double check literally everything he does in case he accidentally sets the office on fire. Except he's the CEO and perfectly willing to override or fire anyone who second guesses his genius. He does not grasp why he doesn't get more honest feedback, though I'm working on that. My role in this is just being a senior-ish dev on an absolutely bulletproof contract, who's been feeling bad about the 2 remaining junior devs and have been doing some overtime, paid, you better effing believe me, to help triage the train wrecks and get things moderately back on track. However, since I'm cheerfully cynical about the whole thing and perfectly willing to call the CEO's BS, what's he going to do, fire me and let the customer direct hire me without breaching their contract? I've somehow been designated as both his friend and only expert worth listening to. I mostly just act as an interpreter between him and the junior devs, since there's a direct correlation between people quitting and how much they have to interact with crazy CEO man. Now on to the second train wreck project. When I first got brought in to survey the wreckage and give my input on what needs to be done to get things back on track, I was told we were writing a fair-sized piece of middleware to transform incoming web requests and then shove them into various databases, replacing a bunch of SQL stored procedures that nobody at the customer's company is qualified to maintain. That all sounded decent enough until I asked to see the requirements and tech design docs, which didn't exist. That's not to say there was nothing. We had piles of documentation on the assorted use cases for the middleware, mostly made by the single junior dev who did 90% of the actual code work, who extracted the data from the customer's team via an absolutely grueling series of meetings. We also had piles and piles of other documentation from the 3-ish prior attempts to inject some amount of sanity and order into the process, which were all put on hold by the CEO, since the team needs to be writing code to show the customer we're working hard. Needless to say, those people quitting was a complete surprise to him. So in short, we've got a project with little to no documentation, but on the bright side, that one junior dev had been soldiering through like a champ, working with the ground level folks at the customer to generate requirements and design on the fly so he could keep writing code, and good code at that. Honestly, it looked to me like all we really had to do was shake some concrete official requirements out of the customer and draw up a decent design doc, and then just let the junior dev keep working without the CEO or customer jogging his elbow all the time. I relay this information to the CEO and volunteer to be the customer shaker for this so I can make sure we actually get what we need, and then get told not to worry about it. He'll handle it personally in his meeting with the customer's chief of ops coming up that week. Well, after several days of working on getting internal documentation straightened out with the team, junior dev, and a newly hired mid-level guy who the CEO fired for not being a team player within the month, I finally get the word back from the CEO about how the meeting with the customer went, and the word is stop. No more coding, none at all. Just sit there and document stuff. I was honestly elated, since this is what I'd been telling him was needed since the start. But then, I found out the reason why. The customer didn't want our code. Not because it was bad, but because he'd never asked for it in the first place. The contract was apparently to analyze their internal system and generate a requirements doc for the customer, preferably without wasting any of his people's time asking silly questions like, well, what their darn requirements are. This is where it finally clicked for me, and I realized that it was the leadership on both sides that was crazy, not just ours. See, anyone who's been around the block a few times as a dev can tell you that requirements are huge, absolutely crucial, and easily F-uppable part of any project. And the surest way to torpedo the whole project is to have the requirements written by people who aren't the actual users. While it's possible to hire a consulting company to help you make a good requirements document, telling them just to do it for you is a catastrophically stupid idea, virtually guaranteed to end with the customer holding a completely useless pile of garbage and lawsuits about how much they'd paid for it. The customer's COO didn't agree though. He didn't want his people wasting their time on planning their own systems upgrade. Those are hours they could be doing real work. This COO guy had gone through negotiations at least 5 different larger contracting firms who all dug in their heels on the requirements issue and refused to take on the project. So, rather than take the effing hint, the COO decides to hire a separate firm just to make the requirements documents, so he could then take them to the larger companies he'd already been negotiating with. Of course, he didn't have much better luck, since now he was just explicitly asking for the stupid part up front, but then enter our CEO, who happily agreed that it sounded totally reasonable and he'd get a team on it right away. The first 2 senior people our CEO tried to put on the contract flatly refused, but one of our project managers was incapable of telling him no. So the project started with the project manager and a few devs, who quickly realized what a crap show this all was and all took turns quitting, until, after 4 complete team changes, it was just the junior dev doing the work and the CEO acting as the project manager. Despite all this turnover and our CEO's magical ability to reshape his perception of reality to fit his internal narrative, this shouldn't have been enough to forget what the whole point of the contract was. But he maintains that the initial customer contract was for a whole rebuild, not just regenerating the requirements for it out of thin air. Fortunately, our CEO had a moment of lucidity and dropped the contract rather than press further. The final cherry on top of this that led to so much wasted code was that the customer's leadership was just as bad at communication as ours, and his entire team thought we were there for a rebuild too. Hence all the time they were willing to spend talking with junior dev and testing his work. We had to tell them what was going on. And at the final meeting, where we handed over the jumbled pile of documentation we'd accumulated and the 85% complete piece of middleware, you could just hear the frustration and resignation in their voices as they talked about how close they got to replacing all the SQL spaghetti they'd been dealing with for the last 10 years. And thus ends the tale of 2 idiots. So Junior Dev is honestly the hero of this story, and if you don't agree with me, I'd love to argue it out with you in the comments down below. So much time, so much effort, picking up the slack and just wanting to impress. I remember being young. Also, does the CEO in this case remind anybody else of Michael Scott? Do me a quick favor, have a look down below the video. If that subscribe button's still red, it means you're not actually subscribed to the KCC channel. Please hit that subscribe button for more daily Reddit stories. Our second story today comes to us from Routine Principle 99. Coding with no specification, the management said, "You don't need a specification, you're being paid to use your brain as well as to code." Let's jump right in. So, as a senior software developer with some 12 years of experience at that point, I was hired to lead a minor group of juniors for a smallish company, 30 to 40 employees. First hint that there might be problems ahead dealing with the management of this particular company was the info I got that the entire previous dev team had rage quit and additionally were being sued by the company. My first task was to reverse engineer VBA scripts embedded in an Excel document made by a competing company. The idea was to import into our database everything as is in string format mostly. The business rules, validations, were implemented within the said Excel template and not in our application. Our application was to simply import user data straight into our data store, no validation, no transformation, and then to export it into a new Excel. This new Excel would then be distributed to the clients, who would then make adjustments to the data. That at this point would pass through validations implemented within the Excel document. As you can see, the idea in its entirety was terrible. The real winner came shortly thereafter, as the sole junior who had been working on an app called AppX for the purpose of this article suddenly quit. The reason he quit was he knew what the true state of the application had been at that point and therefore was 100% certain he could not deliver what was needed to avoid being sued by the client. The guy was a student at the time he was hired by the company to create a C+ application. The problem was he was studying Java. The management of this company was completely oblivious to such nuances. Before he left, he was tasked to leave behind at least some documentation, which he did, but since he was unsupervised, the company could not spare anyone at that time to take a look at the documentation and see if it's okay. So he simply took the screenshots of all the user forms and named them UI1, UI2, etc. The documentation was, therefore, completely useless. At this point, I was given first actual tasks on the AppX. The task was to basically change how the entire application worked in like a 4 weeks time, while simultaneously working on other projects. The application was a bit hard to navigate through. It seemed I could not find any repository classes. Those are usually used to connect to the data store. But I said to myself, hey, the guy was a junior, he probably hid all his SQL statements somewhere, so no problem, I will find where the SQL was sooner or later. The data was present on the front end, the list of users, the list of projects, so stuff seemed to function normally. I was told the application had been in full production for approximately a year, so I was not, yet, alarmed by not being able to immediately find the SQL. Soon thereafter, I needed to rework how the list of projects were displayed to admin users. I could see the list of projects, but the database was empty. No tables, no projects, no nothing. Then it dawned on me. So I did a full find all on the entire project and used one of the project names as a search criteria. And bingo, the entire list was there in HTML hard-coded. Obviously, the entire app was not, at that moment, connected to a data store, and this is how it had been working in production for at least a year. All exceptions were being overridden to return a success message, so all testers on both sides were completely fooled by this. All of the deletes and updates seemed to be working. jQuery had made sure inserts looked semi-okay as well. Okay, so now I was aware of the full context of the problem at hand. I basically needed to connect the app to the data store, featuring some 200-ish UI forms. The management said, how hard can that be for a senior developer? It's a simple task. And under normal circumstances, that would be true. You simply take the specification, model the database as per normalization rules, create repository layer ORM, and design the needed queries. The problem was, the entire thing had to be completed in like 3 weeks. Okay, fine, I said. Give me the specification so I can get started. The sooner I get started, the sooner we will know how quickly the task can be accomplished on one senior developer. So they said, we don't have the specification. Our former employee had it in his Outlook inbox and he left. There's no specification. But a senior developer should not need to be told everything. We expect you to think as well as to act, all within the previously agreed time constraints. The usual managerial mumbo-jumbo when they have no clue whatsoever what they are doing, but are being pressed by impending doom. So I asked, okay, well, can't the PM visit the client and ask what needs to be done? No, the client must not find out that the application has not been finished. It is in production after all. If we were to begin asking such questions at this point, we would end up being sued. So I said, okay, so let us sum this up real quick. The application is a complete fake. It's not connected to an actual data store. The specification is irrevocably gone, and the client thinks that the application is 99% complete and is willing to sue if we don't deliver in 2 weeks. Yes, but that should not be a problem for a senior developer, right? We are paying you after all. Actually, several payments were being late at that moment in time. Right, I immediately began looking for a new job, and the following 2 weeks had passed with no real work being done, so the pressure mounted. I started receiving late-night mails along the lines of, will we have a working sample delivered to test tomorrow morning? So I replied with, no, with kind regards, OP. At the same time, the company brought in a new managing director to fix things, to discipline people, and to make things work. At that point, it was really quite obvious the company was gonna burn down, Hollywood style. The PM began arriving at work at 2 o'clock, proceeding directly to nearby cafe to continue his drinking. He needed to be properly boozed up before even talking to me, because he didn't have a feeling that I was taking this whole thing seriously enough, and that I would cause the company to burn, but at the same time was unable to exert pressure to make me work 120 hours a week. The overtime was unpaid. Right about that point in time, the time for me to go on vacation came. Lest the vacation days be lost, the laws in my country state that if you don't consume your paid vacation time by a certain date, the vacation is permanently lost. So I chose to go on vacation instead of working for the company. That was the final straw. 1 week into my paid vacation, I got summoned to the office and got fired for destroying the company's good name and an excellent project that had been successful in production up to that point. After all, the client had signed the handover, the testers on both sides signed the acceptance documents, a colleague from the other department, SysOps, jumped from his balcony, another colleague threw an ashtray at a waiter at the local bar, entire sales and marketing team left, software development department got closed, the company's assets got frozen. The end. OP mentioned that the first inclination that there might have been a problem was that the entire previous dev team had rage quit. Well, that's not a hint. That's soaking a red flag in nitroglycerin, wrapping it around an anvil, and then dropping it on your own head. You're in for a Wile E. Coyote level of hurt, but you're also running off a cliff with a truck coming at you. Check out both OPs, they are linked in the description down below. I thank you for watching, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.